And in some ways, because it was my brother, and like literally people used to say we look like twins. I didn't always think so, but people always said that. And so, you know, for the first time, like I realized that could have just as easily been me.
The sharp division of people into two main groups.
We opened the paper to see that he had been shot 35 times by the police, unarmed in the alleyway behind his home.
Mothers are still going to be telling their kids to fear for the police.
This is your police department in review.
The justice came to them by the hands of police when it should have come to them by the criminal court system.
Probably the most memorable moment wasn't actually something personal, but it was probably still nonetheless traumatic, was being in elementary school when the Rodney King riots blew up, and seeing the footage of those police officers beating that black man, right? I mean, that got seared into my mind even as a young person, and seeing just the pain and the outrage in my community in response to that, like that's something you just don't forget, you know? But yeah, I've had lots of different experiences of racism. I think that when it comes to connecting it to some of the police brutality that people are concerned with now, one of the most significant things were with my older brother. My older brother, literally a year older than me, shared room with him growing up, my size, my height, my stature. And so when I went off to college, he had stayed back home. And I remember having a phone conversation with my mom as I was out literally feeling kind of carefree in the world and learning that my brother had been arrested. And the story would come out that he was sitting out, hanging out with some friends on the stoop, and a cop drove by multiple times, stopped, came out and arrested him because he fit the description. And the only description was black jeans and black t-shirt and blue jeans. And so it was wild, and he ended up spending a couple months pre-trial locked up before he ended up being released, not fitting the lineup or anything like that. But it just, for the very first time, it wasn't like somebody else's family's problem. And in some ways, because it was my brother, and like literally people used to say we look like twins. I didn't always think so, but people always said that. And so, for the first time, like I realized that could have just as easily been me. Like literally, that could have just been me walking down the street and I could have been grabbed. And so just the pain and the hardship that it caused my brother, our family, like I internalized all that and had to kind of process that, it's easy to know that it happens to other people, but when it gets that intimate, then all of a sudden it kind of like lit a fire in me in terms of just responding and speaking up more intentionally. And so that was one of the things. I mean, I could talk about a lot of other experiences. Again, with police brutality, I would say my younger brother, I got a younger brother that's 9 years younger than me. And my younger brother, I mean, I don't know anybody that's been racially profiled more than him. He decided to move out with his now wife out a little farther outside of like the suburbs of Philly in a predominantly white area. And he's just been stopped like more than you can imagine, just constantly, just over and over and over again. I know on one hand he stands out, but that shouldn't be an excuse for that kind of level of police profiling, searching his car, not kind of taking advantage of him, not always knowing all his rights. It's just ridiculous. Me personally though, my one probably I'd say traumatic experience that I had with police officers happened here in Harrisburg. So I'm living in Harrisburg for the second time, and what I experienced the first time while I was a youth pastor and while I was working for an after-school program for middle school boys here in Harrisburg, driving on 17th Street, get pulled over, have no idea why I'm getting pulled over. Police car's waiting behind me, then another police car shows up on the other side of the car, puts a big spotlight onto my car. And I'm freaking out, thinking like, what in the world is going on? Because I don't think I've broken any traffic laws, and I'm just, clueless to what's happening. Finally, they get out of their cars, two cops come approaching on both sides of my car with their guns drawn, and literally pointed like directly at my head. And so I, of course, freeze. I, of course, am thinking like, what do I do not to get shot? I think about, this is around the time I think where like Sean Bell is killed. You know, just all these things run through your mind, all the lessons you've heard about police brutality and not moving too quickly and making sure that you don't do anything where they think a wallet or something else is a gun. And so all these things are running through my mind. They say that the reason why they pulled me over was because I had an expired sticker on the back of my license plate, which I can't imagine that they actually saw that, but it was just a couple days late. Even if it was, I didn't understand why for just a routine stop, they had their guns drawn at me. And so it's these kind of traumatic experiences that that our society allows, right, for this kind of way of policing Black people. So my family, in a variety of different ways, have experienced the underside, right, of racism through the policing system and the judicial system here in the United States. I could certainly go on and on about other folks as well that I've known that have been impacted as well, but those are some of the more intimate ones that I carry with me that I will never forget. I will actually, let me share one more thing. When I was in Philly, one of my neighbors was a little loud and rowdy one night, and so the cops were called, and they come and they grab him, and they arrest him. He doesn't resist or anything, but they arrest him, throw him down onto the pavement, and he's handcuffed on his stomach with his face to the ground in the same position that, you know, George Floyd, like that was like literally the exact same thing, except the guy also had his hand pushing on his head. It was just like extremely brutal and unnecessary. And to see that happen to literally a friend and neighbor of mine, and to feel helpless in response to that was another, I say, really just one of those moments I can never get out of my mind. I can never unsee that. And so just the casual way in which police brutality can happen, even when people are not being killed, I think is something that leaves lasting memories with me that, you know, just shape who I am and the way I think about these issues. I get angry. It's a mix of anger, it's a much of frustration, also probably a little helpless, right? It's all of those things. I get fired up. And probably at times I get emotional, right? And that's why, like, to be honest, like I never watched the Floyd video. I saw the image, I saw the first couple seconds, I was like, no, that looks just like what they did to my neighbor, and I can't watch that right now. So for me, like, it's traumatic to see that happen to people that you care about. It's traumatic to watch that. That's not something that you can just like go on with your day like nothing happened. When we realize that in our society, the policing system and system of mass incarceration, the unjust judicial system that we have are part of something much bigger, right? These are not just random isolated forms of racism, but they're part of a longer history of racism in our society. And so literally you have to go all the way back to how this country was formed, right? Literally on the genocide and the forcible removal of indigenous people and on the enslavement of African people, right? Literally everything flows out of that. And so when Europeans came to this country, the goal wasn't just to be mean to Black people or to Native Americans. That's not people. It was about gaining wealth and power. It was a selfish, right, reasoning for doing these things, gaining control of land and all these things. And out of that, to be able to have that kind of power meant to control and dominate other people, and dominate and control their resources and their opportunities and the way that they can move and live in a world. And then you have to justify that kind of discrimination. So you have to have ideologies and myths that justify why it's okay to do this to some people because either they're less human or they're dangerous or they're criminal. So all these things, it's this large myth stories, when I say myths, right? Large stories that have been told over and over again to justify why we can treat certain people as less than human and then act like it's not inhumane, and to have so that people who engage in this, whether it be directly or passively, right, however they can sleep at night and still think of themselves as innocent, right? And so in the present day, after centuries of slavery, centuries of Jim Crow, convict leasing systems, sharecropping, peonage systems, terrorism, right? Literally Jim Crow terrorism, KKK and lynchings, all these things up to the 20th century, it's all been about power, At the heart of it, it's about power and control and creating policies and narratives and myths that can justify keeping, some people as have-nots and others as haves, right? And so all of a sudden you can see when black people fled from the South and came up north during the Great Migration, even though white Northerners like to think of themselves as the innocent ones, what did? They forced black people into ghettos, right? Under-resourced ghettos without access to jobs and livable wages, redlining folks into particular neighborhoods where they couldn't have, housing and opportunities to move wherever they wanted to. Public education was never equal to everybody else's education. There's just all these systems, right? Access to healthcare and all the things that neighborhoods need to flourish. All these things are being denied at a systematic level. And how does the police fit into that? They help to repress that, right? Often, if you go beyond just Law and Order TV shows of what we like to think police do, and then actually look at how they've functioned from slave patrols up to the present day, they've actually been used to repress and to over-police and to over-criminalize black and brown people and poor people in general in their neighborhoods, rather than dealing with the structural issues that are actually causing some of these problems in the first place. And so, yeah, my kids, they're here in the city school district, in underfunded school, right? And meanwhile, you have schools that are literally overfunded across the state, right? And the state refusing, but people are unwilling to make those changes because they'll justify, oh, well, black people won't do right with it anyway, and I earned and I deserve this, right? And so there's these narratives and justifications for why it's okay to oppress people in that kind of way. The same thing, livable wages, right? We've seen for decades the suppression of wages over time. And this doesn't just impact black people, though certainly, of course, it disproportionately impacts black people, but it impacts all workers, right? Across the board. And so the suppression of wages is another way in which we see a systemic implementation of economic discrimination, where, again, wealth is being pushed into the hands of the few, and masses of people are struggling, our middle class is shrinking. And so we could go on and on. Healthcare, right? In terms of the ways that healthcare, many people who need it most don't have access to affordable and adequate healthcare and preventative care, right? And of course, we can see in the disparities that black and brown people are disproportionately being impacted by that as well. And of course, even right now, in the midst of a pandemic happening right now, black and brown people dying disproportionately, right? For a whole variety of reasons, but that included is the inadequate healthcare and inadequate treatment when they actually even are getting healthcare in our systems as well. I mean, there's no question that throughout every stage of my schooling, from preschool literally to my PhD program, I've had majority white teachers, even in primarily black communities, right? Almost exclusively, except for, I think I had like 1 or 2 black teachers my whole public education run, right? So not many at all. And same thing with my kids right now, primarily black and brown community. I think they have just a couple black teachers in that school. And so, yeah, there's no question that overall on an educational level, most literature, they centralize European literature, European history, all these things are what are centered. When they do black history, it's tokenized and it's in some ways misrepresented, right? So you get you call it the famous four, right? Dr. King and Frederick Douglass and Rosa Parks and Harriet Tubman or whoever, the four that they want to emphasize, right? But they're told in a way that domesticate their actual legacy, number one, right? So it's not even just bad enough that we don't get a broader range of people, but they domesticate their stories and then try to subsume them somehow into this beautiful story of American exceptionalism where it was all inevitable. Justice and democracy were just an inevitable part of America's ongoing story, when in fact these people were fighting against the way in which America was being America, right? And so we don't even tell honestly we talk about Dr. King and his dream. We don't talk about how very soon after that he said his dream turned into a nightmare. And we don't talk about how he believed that America expressed itself through the big triplets of racism, militarism, and consumerism. And we don't talk about the ways that he was trying to start a poor people's campaign to bring all poor people, black, brown, Native American, and poor white people that were willing to be in solidarity to change this country. So the way that we educate our people, it distorts Dr. King's image. And so when my kids come home from school, just like I came home from school, I see quickly that they've got this kind of distorted narrative of how these things are being taught in the classroom. And so I have to do my own education. But that was the same thing. I unfortunately didn't get the benefit of getting that much of re-education until much later in life. And so there's a lot of these myths and narratives that kids just take for granted, and I certainly did. I would say when I went to college, I remember, so I was at a Christian college where I was the only African American on my floor my first year, and just feeling so isolated and feeling like there were so few faculty members and staff that I could look to, that looked like me, that understood my experiences, right? And it wasn't that there wasn't anyone there that cared, but there's something about having professors and staff that understand your experience, that you can connect with on a deeper level, that we weren't being provided as Black students. So we were being recruited to this space, but not necessarily being given the kind of inclusive practices and staffing and intentionality to actually create the conditions for us to thrive as students. So every single stage of my educational process, I feel like I've been miseducated, and at best, when I thrived, it's because I also was supplementing myself through my own education, right? And picking resources and kind of doing the work on my own. But that's not what education should be. It should be telling a more truthful story, especially to young children if we want to have a better future. I can remember, in fact, even on campus, just alongside of just the teachers and things like that, just the environment there in which many students, just the biases. You think about the learning environment that you actually have to engage in. And there I am as a young African American trying to make sense of this college experience. And I'm hearing white students refer to other Black students as thugs, right? And saying, oh, they don't really belong here. They're here because they're on the basketball team or things like that. And just the scarring and trauma, again, in a different kind of way, when you just hear it over and over and over again, these rationales for why you don't belong or your friends don't really belong here. And so these are the conditions in which Black people often are learning and having to learn, right? Not in favorable conditions, but literally as their humanity is being questioned and assaulted all the time. I mean, so I've often talked about how, there's this weird way in which my time on campus at this majority historically white campus, on one hand, I would say that it was the friendliest and nicest place you can ever be, right? People are smiling and throwing frisbees around and they're enjoying themselves. And at the exact same time, there are these assaults, these little slights, right? Whether it be people kind of dodging you, not looking you in your eye, acting strange. Things that honestly, my first year, I probably didn't even really fully notice or understand, but you see it over and over and over again, the slights, the comments that just insult either you or your friends. Again, this idea of like calling people thugs, right? Casually, people that they don't even know very well, but so casually just can call someone a thug. And they don't realize just, again, I call it 1,000 paper cuts. And by the 1,000th one, you hurt like hell, right? And you're wounded, and you don't leave that place the same as you came because of that. And so I think that we misunderstand that the accumulation of those things is abuse, literally. It's racial abuse. When people are assaulted with those comments over and over and over again. One thing, please, that's not gonna bother me. But if you're immersed and soaked in that all the time, how does your psyche not get wounded from all of that assault ongoing on your humanity? One way that I've been describing helping people think about Black people's response to police brutality and why people riot, and why our response to it is not very helpful. I think that the way that I've been describing it now is to think of like, imagine me as a grown adult beating up on a 2-year-old child, on top of them, punching them, right? And then someone seeing that 2-year-old child punch me back, and then go intervening and saying, don't punch back. Punching is not right. It's inappropriate for you to be punching someone like that. It's not healthy. There's nothing productive to do, comes from you punching people, right? That would be ridiculous. It would be literally nonsensical to even spend your time worrying about how this little 2-year-old child is responding to being beaten up, right? The real issue at hand at that point is to get the adult to stop pounding on this little child. And that's the same thing with literally the United States government has been beaten down and repressing and oppressing our people for centuries, destroying our communities for centuries. And the first thing that people want to say is, oh, what about the Target or something? Who cares about Target right now? In the grand scheme of things, that really doesn't matter given the weight of what's actually happening. I actually don't think that the child punching back is necessarily productive and is going to break the cycle, but that is not the issue of the real violence that's happening right in that moment. And so I think that we lack the ability to see what's actually happening all around us because we're so individualistic in terms of how we focus on racism, and we usually focus it on what black people are doing and on policing black people's behavior and not focusing on these bigger issues in terms of how the harm that's being caused by these systems and institutions and policies that are destroying black people's lives. And because it's less personal now, right? Because racism through these institutions, it's not the same as the KKK burning, a cross in someone's yard, and they're not the ones lynching people. It's a lot more sophisticated now, right? So people's hands can be clean. One way, actually, I'll say one more story. I've often talked about the incident with Paula Deen several years ago and how our society responded to that. And I think that actually helps us see how we miss and misunderstand the systemic side of racism. And so when Paula Deen said, I think she wanted like a plantation wedding, and she had used the N-word, and all these things came out, and everybody, it was actually really fascinating, everybody across the board, shame Paula Deen, bad Paula Deen, how racist of you, bad, 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 right? And it was in one accord, everybody together knew Paula Deen was a racist. And that's fine, of course. It was clearly, explicitly racist what she was doing, what she was saying. I'm not going to be I'll be the last person to excuse what she did. But it was interesting that everyone could so easily scapegoat and say bad Paula Deen. That was actually the more interesting thing, right? How is it that everybody could actually be so easily scapegoat Paula Deen as if she's like some random isolated person practicing racism, as though somehow you'd think she was like a mad scientist that cooked racism up by herself and poured it out and exposed our society to it. No, Paula Deen didn't create racism, right? Paula Deen is not the initiator of any of these things. If anything, if you want to understand Paula Deen and the ideas that she said, all you have to do is read American history, right? Read a history book, and you can see exactly where these ideas came from. They didn't come from Paula Deen's head by herself. She was socialized by communities and a society that taught her these things, that socialized her into these ideas. And so how dare the whole society just point the finger at Paula Deen as if the whole society isn't also culpable, as if the whole society hasn't had centuries of systems and institutions and narratives that have justified the oppression of black people. And so it's too easy for some folks to scapegoat the bad racists and then imagine themselves as having their hands clean, when in fact the matter is, everyone who participates in the society is a part of the society. And everybody that wants to scapegoat, they're also complicit. And if they're not being intentionally and actively anti-racist, then they're part of the problem as well. And so I think that we've got to change our paradigm in such a way that, we've got to certainly not excuse explicit old school racism, but we also can't excuse new school sophisticated racism where we can continue to benefit from advantages from some and the disadvantages of others and saying nothing, right? So we all have to kind of find the better person within us and challenge our communities to be better and to be honest and to do some self-examination work, and then commit to standing in solidarity with our brothers and sisters that are most vulnerable. I think if we are going to make a change, we're going to have to make a multi-level change, right? First and foremost, it begins with us, that we've got to do our work, right? Each and every person's got to do their own work. They've got to do the hard self-examination work. They've got to work to think about their own practices. They've got to re-educate themselves, unlearn and relearn, but it can't just be head knowledge. A lot of people, there's groups who can sit around and read books all day and they don't actually get into action and responding to it. So there's got to be action and living in different kind of ways, making different kind of decisions that are intentionally and explicitly anti-racist. So that's one level. And then there's the interpersonal level where we've got to have harder conversations with one another, truthful conversations, open conversations that are both curious in some sense in terms of trying to actually seek the truth, but also that are willing to hold each other accountable to being better, right? Asking more of one another. And that includes family members, friends, co-workers, and even folks in power above you, right? That we've got to have those kind of better conversations. I think we've got to look at our communities. You think about like congregations and faith communities that gather regularly. In what ways does white supremacy and racism unconsciously shape the way that they gather, their preferences, their ideologies, their commitments, and what the kind of way that they form people, right? Because everything forms you. People are shaped by the convictions and the narratives and the practices and the example that the community around them live by. So how do we change those kind of things as well are really important. So our institutions and our communities, we have to look at their policies and practices, structures, and even the unwritten rules that we kind of take for granted that nonetheless shape who we are. But then we've got to go at a much higher level in terms of looking at policies and structures and institutions on a more systemic level across the states. We sometimes miss that the real function of racism is not about personal prejudice. It's about how we organize our society. And so if we pay attention to how we actually are organizing our society in terms of funding and who has access to resources, right? And who has access to housing and livable wages and all these things, then we see bigger problems and issues. And that's why we can have a deeper conversation then around mass incarceration in our judicial system and policing, when we actually see that these are widespread problems rather than just bad apples or random incidents, right? These are not random incidents in terms of police killings. These are the inevitable things that are gonna happen when you have over-policing of Black and brown neighborhoods the way that we do, and we criminalize Black and brown people for every minor infraction and broken window practices, right, of policing and things like that. And so we've got to look at these bigger assumptions that shape our policies and practices, our institutions all across our society, and be committed to actually changing the way that we organize our society. And I'll get back to that in a second in terms of what some of that looks like. But I think the other narrative, just one higher than that, which often gets lost, is the narrative level. It's the myths and the stories and the values that we run by, because that cultural level is really powerful. And so we actually have to tell a more truthful story. And that's what we've struggled to do in the United States. We've never actually been able to tell a truthful story about our foundations of how this country came to be. We tell this really beautiful story about a chosen nation, an innocent nation, and all these things that denied the suffering and the oppression and the pain that's been caused, the lives that have been destroyed to create what exists now today and continues to destroy lives in the process. So we've got to do a cultural shift of telling more truthful stories so that maybe one day we can be like Germany, where it's not okay to have, Nazi statues being celebrated in the streets. But until we're willing to actually grapple and look in the mirror as a nation, as a people, I think we can't get there. And so we've got a lot of work to do on the cultural level as well, so that we can be honest about this nation, its origins, and maybe then redirecting it. But I think that if we're going to make some change, it's actually going to have to start at the grassroots level. That people on the ground, in their communities, not first in terms of who we're going to vote for president. Yes, that matters. I vote. We got to do that. But we got to do the grassroots work in our own communities. We got to be pulling people together. We got to be organizing. We got to be linking arms with folks. We got to be making like coalitions of groups together who recognize that all of our well-being is bound up in one another, and that if we're going to flourish, all of us need to flourish together. And this won't be short-term work. This will be work that will demand that we're in it for the long haul. And so that's the kind of work that I think that we've got to get committed to. Right now, we're so locked into our partisan politics in such a way that the platforms actually decide for us what matters to us. We allow donors basically to tell parties to tell us what our platform is going to be, rather than us going and hearing the needs of our neighbors and folks that we care about, and starting from there on the ground and saying, these are the issues that are hurting us most. We do the work, we do the research, and then we organize, and we go and we, with power, right? Not centralized top-down power, but decentralized power of the people, literally going back and saying, this is what matters. These are the issues that are impacting us, and we will not go away, and we're here for the long haul. And I think if we can do that, we can really see really significant change happen in our country.